Ladies and gentlemen, good morning and welcome. My name is Mark Donfried, the director of the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy, and it's an honor to have the privilege of welcoming you here today in the headquarters of National Public Radio on behalf of the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy, as well as on behalf of the Chertoff Group. We're really happy to be co-hosting this conference for you the next few days, and it's a theme that really is of vital importance to the field of cultural diplomacy. The International Symposium on Cultural Diplomacy in the USA, a global dialogue about cultural diplomacy, national security, and global risks. When we first started the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy, it was actually in 1999, and at that time there was actually no non-governmental organization in the world dedicated to cultural diplomacy. There was a tremendous need for research in the field of cultural diplomacy. There was really not any teaching on cultural diplomacy, and the programs that existed were primarily governmental, meaning it was this more old-school idea: how do we win the hearts and minds of foreign audiences, or how do we attract others to like us, whether we talk about the British Council or the Alliance Française or the Goethe Institute, or during the Cold War period, the famous America House representing the USA. And I think Joseph Nye would argue in the Cold War period that worked very well. And really the fall of the Berlin Wall was a success of what he calls smart power. You had this threat of imminent destruction in the background, and that allowed for the soft power to take place, or this power of attraction. And when the Berlin Wall came down, it didn't come down by tanks and bombs and missiles, but it came down by private individuals with hammers and chisels who wanted to get to the other side, either because they were attracted to one way of life or perhaps disillusioned with another. So I think in certain time periods, this actually can be quite effective, this idea of soft power, persuasion, power of attraction. However, today at the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy, we see a far greater need in the world, not for persuasion, but rather for understanding and trust. So for us at the Institute, when we talk about cultural diplomacy, we're really talking about how do we help educate, enhance, and sustain relationships, with the goal of that relationship being truly based on dialogue, understanding, and trust. And I would argue that's necessary for Republicans and Democrats, just as it is for Muslims and Jews and Christians, as it is for Americans and the rest of the world. Really, every relationship, I think that should be at the center. We don't have to agree, but ideally we should trust each other and we should understand each other. And that can really enable any kind of collaboration, whether it's a peace treaty or a business deal. So as we talk about cultural diplomacy the next few days, I'd suggest to us really open up our minds and think to ourselves, how might we be able to facilitate understanding and trust through culture, whether it's educational exchanges, whether it's music, whether it's sports, whether it's the arts. We believe at the Institute this can be very effective when you have two countries that want to work together, two countries that are at peace, as well as for countries that don't necessarily want to work together, and even countries in conflict. You need different strategies in those situations. But I think really this smart power strategy, so to speak, that Professor Nye so eloquently has expressed for us, is really the key combination. That's why it's not a coincidence that Secretary Chertoff and I have teamed up really to look at both sides, in the sense, how can we look at the security issues as well as the soft power issues? In the end, I think that comprehensive strategy will lead us to much greater success than if we just have a focus on cultural diplomacy and soft power, or just to focus on hard power. So I think that's the challenge for us the next few days, to try to figure out how might we better balance these strategies when dealing with a wide variety of issues around the world. I'm grateful the next few days we have experts almost from every continent. So we have a few regional focus areas that we can go into. We have many Americans speaking to us, but also many from around the world. So really, I'd encourage you, make use of those opportunities. Pose questions, make use of the coffee breaks, exchange business cards. I think the informal discussions can be just as effective sometimes as the formal discussions. So I very much hope that you will enjoy the next few days. I'm looking forward also to getting to know you, and I think by the end of the week, I may not necessarily have convinced you that cultural diplomacy is more important or less important, but I'm hoping that you will at least think a little bit differently about one issue or the other issue based on the different areas of expertise that we'll cover throughout the conference. So I'm really happy to have you here. I'll say a little bit more later in the day, in the next few days, about the work of the ICD and also some of our own ideas on the future of cultural diplomacy. But what I'd like to do now is say a few words of introduction for our opening keynote speaker of the day. Ladies and gentlemen, I had the pleasure of getting to know Secretary Chertoff, I think it was about two and a half years ago, when he first gave a keynote address at the German Marshall Fund for a conference that we had organized on also soft power. Out of that has grown a wonderful collaboration and partnership. I'm proud to consider him a member of the advisory board of the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy, and in many ways really has assisted us also in terms of guiding us. I've been out of the United States for about 12 years, even though I am an American living in Berlin. So in that sense, really to get that navigation again in terms of also the right individuals, the right partners in the U.S. has been very helpful. So I'm really grateful personally that you're here, Secretary Chertoff, that we could collaborate also in this event. And I'd like to say a few words of background about the very impressive professional career of Secretary Chertoff. Michael Chertoff served as Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security during President George W. Bush and co-authored the USA Patriot Act. As Secretary, Mr. Chertoff developed and implemented border security and immigration policy, promulgated homeland security regulations, and spearheaded a national cybersecurity strategy. He also served periodically on the National Security Council and the Homeland Security Council, as well as on the Committee for Foreign Investments in the United States. Before heading to the Department of Homeland Security, Mr. Chertoff served as federal judge on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit. Earlier, Mr. Chertoff was the Assistant Attorney General for the Criminal Division of the U.S. Department of Justice, and during more than a decade as a federal prosecutor, including service as the U.S. Attorney in the District of New Jersey. First Assistant U.S. Attorney for the District of New Jersey, and then Assistant U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, Mr. Chertoff investigated and prosecuted cases of political corruption, organized crime, and corporate fraud and terrorism, including the investigation of the 9/11 terrorist attacks. Since leaving government, Mr. Chertoff has co-founded the Chertoff Group, a risk management and security consulting company which provides high-level strategic counsel to corporate and governmental leaders on a broad range of security issues. In addition to his roles in the Chertoff Group, Mr. Chertoff is also senior of counsel of Covington & Burling, LLP, and member of the firm's White Collar Defense and Investigations Practice Group. The lecture topic that he'll be speaking on this morning is the role of soft power to the world today. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in a very, very warm welcome for Secretary Michael Chertoff. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thanks, Mark. And Mark's a dynamo. He really knows how to generate energy and enthusiasm for cultural diplomacy and soft power. And I'm delighted to talk to you a little bit about that this morning. The term soft power was, of course, coined by Joseph Nye, who's also coined smart power. And just full disclosure, he's on the board of advisors of my consulting firm, and he's a personal friend as well as someone who I admire. I think what he's put his finger on, though, is the fact that from a national security standpoint, we live in a very complex world. Those of us who grew up in the Cold War era, which is not many people in the room I can see right now, since the age is perhaps a little too low for that. But those of us who grew up in the Cold War era got very accustomed to a binary security environment in which there were basically two powers. I mean, China was kind of off there a little bit on its own, but is the Soviet Union and the United States. And all national security issues really fell into that spectrum of whether it was the U.S. or the Soviet Union or powers that were allied with them. And all of the security discussion was really about the hardest of hard power. How many missiles you had, how many bombers you had, what the throw weight was of the weapons, who could annihilate who more quickly and still have survivable delivery means ahead of them. What we now realize, though, is even in that period of time, things were a lot more complex from a security standpoint. And it wasn't just about metal and explosions, but it was a lot about people. There was an old expression back in the days of Vietnam: grab people by a certain part of the anatomy and their hearts and minds will follow. And I guess in a funny way that was a tribute to the idea that you did have to get their hearts and minds. And that was a large part of what defined security. We see a development of that now in what is sometimes described as counterinsurgency strategy, which is a fancy term for recognizing that in the end, security in any location, in any situation, depends upon having the allegiance and the agreement of the people in the area that you're concerned about. The population has to be on board. Ultimately, there cannot be a stable environment and a stable security environment unless you have the people who are comfortable and satisfied with the environment in which they're operating. And so it does become very much about hearts and minds. We also live in a much more complex environment now than we did during the days of the Cold War. It's no longer just a world of two poles, it's a world of multiple poles. Global travel, trade, and finance have dramatically increased the leverage not only of a lot of different states in the global environment, but of non-state networks, whether they're networks for good or networks for bad, whether they're NGOs or terrorist organizations. These groups now can have global impact because they can travel around the world, they can connect through the internet and communicate on a global basis, and they can move money around the world. So the number of players who have a role in the security situation globally has dramatically expanded. That's coupled with a technological revolution. the things we used to worry about from a security standpoint were basically in the domain of nation states. But now, because of technology, the capability of non-state actors to cause damage and destruction has significantly increased. And that means what non-state actors do, what individuals do, what networks and groups do, become much more consequential from a global standpoint. And so again, the issue of hearts and minds, the issue of how do you command allegiance through what you attract rather than what you compel, becomes a much more salient issue in the way we look at our national security strategy. In the end, soft power is one of the critical instruments of national power and of national stability. Being able to motivate tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of people with an idea is as important, if not more important, as the ability to try to propel them using threats or violence. And even when you believe that hard power is important, hard power cannot be successful if it's not accompanied by soft power. If at the end of the day, the gains that you make in security using strength and the military are not substantiated and filled in by building an environment in which people feel that they can prosper, that they can have safety and security, and that they're being treated fairly. Exhibit A for this is the Arab Spring, and that's really mostly what I want to talk about. Now, maybe that's a little bit of a misnomer because, first of all, we're way past spring, and second, it's been, frankly, a mixed bag in terms of what's come out of the Arab Spring. But I think there's a great lesson in that. So let's evaluate what's occurred in the last 18 months in stages. Of course, as you all know, and it's now been well understood, the flashpoint which set forth the Arab Spring involved a Tunisian who was being treated unfairly by a local police official, and when he couldn't get redress from the local authorities, he wound up setting himself on fire. And that act of immolation set forth a conflagration in the country that resulted in the overthrow of the dictator and now an elected government in Tunisia. And it spread across many other countries in the Arab world. We saw it in Egypt, we saw it in Libya, and we saw it in other parts of the region. What mattered there was not guns, it was the power of an idea, it was the power of frustration of people who felt they were living in an arbitrary circumstance, without a rule of law, without fairness, with too much of the decision-making being nepotism rather than what we would consider to be the merits of something. It was also obviously compounded by economic issues, questions of opportunity, questions of employment, question of whether people could even afford the basic necessities of life by bread. When you mix all that together, and particularly when you add the power of ideas like having fairness, like having rule of law, like having democracy, that is a powerful force. And it was so powerful that it overwhelmed even regimes that were used to operating with quite a bit of oppressiveness and a strong dose of military authority. We saw that in Libya and we saw that in Egypt. What this teaches us is, in the end, much of what was critical in changing the circumstances on the ground was an understanding of the way people of all ages and people both in cities and in the countryside, what they were feeling and what they were thinking and what kinds of ideas could mobilize them. We all saw the pictures in Egypt of people going to Tahrir Square and how over a period of time that pushed the military regime in ultimately pushing Mubarak out of power and moving in the direction of what is now beginning to look like perhaps a democracy, perhaps not, but at least something that resembles more of a parliamentary system than what you had before. But at the same time, as we look at what's happening in the Arab Spring, we see the importance not just of launching something, but of carrying through with it. And I think this is another example of soft power and the importance of cultural diplomacy. First, what you see is a hunger in these regions to reach out, not necessarily to foreign governments, but to foreign counterparts, to people around the world and organizations around the world who have ideas and advice that can be incorporated in these new emerging regimes in the Middle East. We see efforts to bring in folks to teach about the rule of law. What does it mean to actually have an independent legal system? What does it mean to have democracy? What is the role of free speech? It's no accident that the internet has been perhaps not the only pivotal element, but a pivotal element in what has transformed the region, just as Al Jazeera and other media have been, because it's about communicating images, it's about communicating facts, and it's about communicating ideas and advice in a global environment. Now, I'd be Pollyannish if I said that's all that's involved, because what we also see in places like Libya and Egypt is that soft power is not the only kind of power that matters. Hard power still does matter. Libya, obviously, in order to reach the point it has now, and it's by no means an end point, did in fact rely upon not only the power of the militias that were pushing back against Gaddafi, but relied as well upon NATO, which played a role with airstrikes in pushing Gaddafi and ultimately having him eliminated as the dictator in Libya. In Egypt as well, we've seen a push and pull between the forces that want more order and those that are in the street. And we've seen the military continues to play a very powerful and important role. And what this tells us is that soft power, while it's become increasingly important, is not going to completely supplant hard power. And it's the mix of these two that I think are going to be critical in terms of what ultimately results in Egypt and in Libya and in other parts of the region. Another part of what we can look at in terms of a history of how hard and soft power play in the modern world is what's been the history of Iraq and Afghanistan in the last 10 years. And I'll come back to that point I made earlier about counterinsurgency. What counterinsurgency is about is understanding that hard power must be supported by building frameworks and communities that ultimately can command allegiance, can create safety, and also create space for people to build functioning societies. Part of the change in strategy in Iraq through the surge was a recognition that there had to be sufficient hard power to allow space for soft power to develop, to allow space for people to actually build functioning societies and to be able to develop and allow their freedom to begin to take root. And that's very much at the heart of the debate about what's going on in Afghanistan now. Even as there are military operations against the Taliban, the critical questions aren't only going to be resolved by military power. They're going to be resolved by questions like, will there be a functioning of rule of law? Will there be corruption in Afghanistan? Or will people feel they're having a fair shake? And that's, I think, critically important in sustaining the security goals there. Will there be economic development? And again, it's no accident that the Taliban have often targeted aid workers and those who are involved in economic projects, because they recognize as well that if you're capable of building an infrastructure of economy and the rule of law and democracy, that is where you get the resistance to terrorism and the resistance to hostile forces. And therefore, they understand it's important to uproot the elements of soft power if they're going to triumph with their own form of hard power. So when we look at the security around the globe now, it becomes obvious that you have to think of a broader array of tools and a broader array of capabilities in developing the kinds of enduring circumstances that allow us to talk about safe and secure societies. Now, what does that mean for the United States and how we move forward? It's no accident that we're at a time that people are questioning the future role of our security strategies, because we have a very serious budget crisis, not only in this country, but around the world. And without getting into the details of all the various budget debates, it's clear there are going to be very substantial cuts in Europe as well as in the United States across a whole array of government programs, including the security programs. So people have to ask, how do we use the resources that we're going to have in the future, which will be more limited, in the most effective way possible to get the most value for the buck, so to speak? And here's where, again, I think the use of soft power, and particularly cultural diplomacy, people power, non-governmental organizations, becomes an important part of a security strategy. Remember, we are now facing threats that come not just from one or two nation states, but from multiple nation states and multiple areas of ungoverned space. Let's just look at where we've moved in the last 10 years. 10 years ago, when we went into Afghanistan, if you just look at Al-Qaeda, the core and the main generator of terrorism, the kind of central command, was in Afghanistan and in Pakistan. Now, that has degraded over the last 10 years, although it has not been eliminated. But what has also happened is we've now seen Al-Qaeda and similar groups take root in Somalia, in other parts of East Africa, in the Maghreb area, in Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb, even in Nigeria, and of course in Southeast Asia as well. What that means is we're now looking at many more locations which can be the platforms from which attacks are launched, not only within the region, but in other parts of the world as well. So how do you deal with all these things? There aren't enough troops and enough aircraft, even if you wanted to rely only on hard power, to try to root out and eliminate these groups all over the place. What you have to do is you have to start building conditions on the ground that become inhospitable to terrorism and inhospitable to violence and extremism. And that becomes as much about soft power as it is hard power. And I'm not suggesting we eliminate hard power. I'm just suggesting it's not enough. So, and here I'll take a leaf out of what some of the terrorist groups themselves have learned. If you look, for example, at a group like Hezbollah, Hezbollah has spent an awful lot of effort in Lebanon building social services. They understand from a strategic standpoint that while they are certainly focused on building up their military capabilities, and they're willing to use those military capabilities and fire rockets and things of that sort, they know in order to command the allegiance of the people with which they operate, they've got to give them social services. They've got to give them some soft power and some idea that will attract them. And I would argue that when you're countering groups that are violent and extreme, you've got to do the same thing. An interesting experience I've had since I've left government is riding in taxi cabs in Washington. And what I've discovered about taxi cab drivers in Washington are, first, most of them are born elsewhere and have come to the U.S. from Africa or South America or other parts of the world. Second, they are insatiable consumers of news, because I'm almost always recognized when I get in the back of a taxi cab. And people will the driver will comment on having seen me on a news show or something of that sort. And the third thing is they're very interested in current events, and particularly what's gone on in their home country. And what has struck me often is hearing cab drivers from Africa tell me how important it was to them and to their families that the U.S. over the last 8 to 10 years devoted a significant amount of effort into combating AIDS through the PEPFAR program and fighting against malaria and other kinds of diseases. These were programs, some of which were supported by the government, a lot of which were operationalized by charities, that don't get a lot of press. You don't usually see big stories like you do every time there's a bombing. But in fact, it's had an incredible amount of impact in large parts of Africa in building not only safer and healthier societies, but in building a lot of goodwill to the United States. And it's that kind of goodwill that builds resistance to terrorism, violence, and extremism. And that, to me, is a great and important metric in terms of showing the importance of cultural diplomacy and soft power. So part of what I want to say is this. As we talk about where our budget is and where we're going to spend money in the future, and I'm a big believer in not overdoing on the defense cuts, we also have to make sure we continue to fund things like foreign aid, education for foreigners to come to the U.S. We build real value when people come to the United States and are educated here and then go back to their home countries. And we lose a lot of value when we cut that off. Some will tell you that one of the reasons we have a problem in Pakistan now is there was a period of time in the 90s that because of our unhappiness with the Pakistani nuclear program, we cut off the flow of junior grade Pakistani military officers to come to the U.S. for training. And as a consequence, there are now senior officers who have no feeling for the United States and no particular regard for American values because they never had the experience of being here. So I think it may turn out that was a very short-sighted policy. I would argue that you get a lot of bang for the buck if you bring people over and educate them, and if you continue to make sure that we are engaging in these aid programs, particularly if we can do it through private entities and not only through the government. And that's why I want to make sure that as we look at our budgets going forward, we don't simply view these programs as expendable. In the end, when you build a strategy for global security, and it really is security for everybody, it has got to be a combination of hard power and soft power. In the end, whether you succeed or fail is going to be all about what people think and what about the perception they have is of what the outcome was, whether it was a success or a failure. There's a book I read a few years ago, which I've recommended, called Failing to Win. I've forgotten the name of the authors, although they recently corresponded with me to thank me for touting the book. But the point of the book is that if you look at military operations in the last several decades, whether they were victories or losses were in almost every case, with some rare exceptions, a function of whether people's expectations about the outcome were in fact exceeded or fell short in terms of the reality. In other words, it was the way people perceived the outcome that mattered, not so much the objective metrics of the outcome. So, for example, the now, I think, pretty well-known story of the Tet Offensive in the 1960s, where the North Vietnamese actually entered the cities of South Vietnam and were soundly defeated in military terms, but, quote, won that engagement because from the American public standpoint, the fact that the North Vietnamese could be in the city was seen as a defeat because the expectation of their weakness was exceeded by what they were able to do, even though at the end of the day they were thrown out. And when Walter Cronkite famously said on TV, to the effect that now we've lost, that change in perception actually had an impact on the outcome of the war. Similar example is the 2006 war between Israel and Hezbollah, where at the end of the day, the perception that Israel lost was not so much a function of the metrics of a military outcome, but simply the fact that Hezbollah had been able to stay in the fight and inflict damage exceeded expectations and therefore resulted in a perception of victory that actually had a real operational impact on the ground. So at the end of the day, that's my kind of bottom line security message for the 21st century. Whether you succeed or fail in security, there'll obviously always be objective reality and things that you can measure in numbers, but a lot of it will be what is in people's heads, the subjective expectations and subjective beliefs. And that means in fighting to raise the level of global security, we're going to have to be using all the tools of power, those that persuade as well as those that push, and we're going to have to be attentive to what is in people's minds as well as to the more visible physical facts on the ground. So with that, I'd be happy to take some questions.
My name is Sherry Mueller, and I'm President Emeritus of something called the National Council for International Visitors, the State Department's private sector partner on the International Visitor Program. Thank you very much. It was very helpful. As somebody who's tried to impact the U.S. Congress and help them understand the value of international exchange programs, whether you're talking about our Fulbright program or others, what do you think are the most compelling arguments for some of our more insular Congress people?
A great question. Here's the argument I would make, and I'd go to the Arab Spring. We're seeing huge ferment in parts of the world, in various regions. But the outcome of that ferment is not at all clear. So how do you influence, and I mean this in a benign way, I don't mean in a nefarious way, how do you influence conditions so as to make it more likely that what emerges at the end of the day are societies that, while not duplications of the West, foster values that I think we believe are universal values: rule of law, freedom, settling disputes peaceably, renouncing extremism and violence. You can use certain tools that are harder tools, like threats of withdrawing aid or granting aid, or even in some cases military threats. But truthfully, those don't work that well, as we've seen. We haven't been able to use that to influence things in the last 18 months. Bringing people over or going over there and working on one-on-one and in groups with people at the grassroots, I think can have a huge impact in terms of turning things in a direction that are more benign. That's a long-term investment in security that's every bit as important as investing in military hardware and things of that sort. Just to give you one example, we're in the middle of a very difficult period with Pakistan. And there are a lot of elements to that. And people talk a lot about the fact that, maybe we're giving too much aid or too little aid or too many strings attached or too few strings attached. But let's go below the surface of just the fighting that's reported in the paper between the military and the court and the elected government. Let's look at the fact that if you look at polling data, something like 80 to 90% of people in Pakistan have a negative view of the United States. That makes for a very difficult security situation. If every time there's a violent encounter, in the frontier areas where the U.S. is taking some kind of kinetic action, the Pakistani public automatically reacts negatively to the U.S. and takes the side of the terrorist or takes the side of the Taliban. That's a fundamental problem that's not going to be cured just by having a change in leadership. So how do you change that? Well, I would argue part of the reason you get that negative reaction is because we had that lost generation of younger Pakistanis who didn't come over. So I think there's a hard-headed, I'm not like a softie by reputation, I think there's a hard-headed security argument to be made for investing in getting to know people and getting them to know us.
So now you can see why we invited Secretary Chertoff to the advisory board. I think you were next, and then we'll come to the front.
Hello, my name is Shko Abdul Qadir. I'm from Kurdistan region of Iraq. You spoke about the Middle East and the Arab Spring, and I have some questions. First, in where we live, the Arab Spring started first in Tunisia, but then people changed the name of Arab Spring to Islamic Spring more. Because as you see now, the Islamic parties will be ruling Egypt, Tunisia, as well as the Libya. How will this affect the relations of these countries with the United States? That's my first. The second question is, you spoke about inviting people to the U.S. and educating them. Why do you think there's this misunderstanding and bad image from, let's say, Middle East mostly about the U.S. and why do you see the need of educating people from outside? Last question, you spoke about the Arabs. Sorry. The third question is, as a Kurd, there are 40 million Kurds living in the Middle East. And right now, in Iraq, there's a huge political issues, as I'm sure you have following the news. And in Turkey as well, PKKs are fighting the government. In Iran, there are Kurds fighting the government. How do you connect this Kurd soft power and their future? Speaking of soft power, thank you.
All right, so I don't know if I can answer all three questions. Obviously there's a great deal of interest in watching the outcome of whatever kind of spring you want to call it in the Middle East, and we've seen an Islamist party elected in Tunisia. Obviously, the party that's currently controlling Turkey is an Islamist party. I think that there's a lot to be learned about the nuances between different parties. I don't think it's sufficient to simply say secular parties are good, Islamist parties are bad. That's not, I think, reality. By the way, in Europe for a long time there have been so-called Christian democratic parties that are not really particularly Christian. I mean, it's kind of a legacy name. I think what we will see is an array of parties, Islamist parties, just as you could see an array of secular parties. Some of them will be pro-U.S., uphold the values of tolerance of religious minorities, rule of law, freedom of speech. There may be some Islamist parties who do not uphold those values. And I don't think you can generalize. I think you've got to take each party on its own terms. They're all going to be, there are similarities, but frankly, there are a lot of differences. And a lot of the differences are, what you find, for example, in North Africa and the form of Islamist party there may be very different from what you would find for an Islamist party in another part of the world. So I think we have to be careful not to prejudge and use labels to box parties one way or the other. I think we've got to be open to dealing with parties that will have a religious influence, just as we have religious influences among some of the political actors in the U.S., and be looking more to questions like, are they tolerant of different religions? Are they accepting of freedom of speech? Do they believe in a rule of law and neutral principles? And I think as long as parties subscribe to those principles, we ought to embrace them, whether they describe themselves as Islamist or not. And if the leaders of countries don't embrace those principles, and it doesn't matter whether they're Islamist or secular, we should view that as a negative development. As to why there's a negative feeling to the U.S. in the Middle East, I don't know that I would say there is a negative feeling. Pakistan seems oddly to be more negative, I think, than other countries have a more negative attitude among the population than other countries do in the Middle East. I do think, there's a lot of urban legend about what America's like and what Americans do. And I know, for example, I have friends who are Muslim Americans who've gone to the Middle East and are amazed at some of the misconceptions about their lives in the U.S. in the Middle East, which they correct. That's another good reason for having a lot of exchanges. It's a lot easier to dispel these notions if people can come and go and begin to see the way we actually live on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean. So, I think that there's, in a funny way, I don't know whether the modern media and the internet help or hurt. It certainly creates the opportunity for people to interact across these borders and to learn something about each other in a way that I think is very positive. On the other hand, we know that the internet also can be a vehicle for teaching people how to become extreme and how to make bombs. So again, these things are mixed. But the one thing I can tell you is we need to pay attention to it. And we need to do what we can to thicken the relationships, because I think on balance, I think our values I'm proud to show the world. And I think the world will largely, not always, but largely find positive elements in our values. And while not expecting everybody to adopt them, lock, stock, and barrel, I think that some of the basic principles will appeal universally. So I'm a big believer in exchanges promoting that.
Okay, I think who is next? Was there a hand in the front? Okay, ladies first, and then maybe one more.
Thank you for your address, Mr. Chertoff. Ina Van Beer, former president of the San Diego World Affairs Council. Question, cybersecurity and diplomacy. Facing challenges, none of the languages for the Den Haag Agreement, Geneva Convention, or UN Charter include cybersecurity. What can cultural diplomacy do to further the understanding and promote cultural diplomacy in a much needed global era?
Yeah, well, so cybersecurity, that's like a topic for a whole other 10 speeches. Let me just kind of give you a very fast survey. We mean different things by cybersecurity, and I think it's important to make sure that we distinguish among them. I think in the U.S., when we talk about cybersecurity, we mean the security that you should feel that the data on your network, whether you're an individual or a business, can't be stolen. Your identity can't be stolen. And that someone should not be able to come into your network and degrade it or interfere with it or actually disrupt it. That's a very important but a pretty narrow definition of cybersecurity. There are other countries in the world where cybersecurity means the right to be secure from ideas that the government doesn't like, which we generally call censorship. And for example, China is a country, I think, which has a somewhat different view of cybersecurity. This is a really important issue because right now, as a matter of fact, there's debate about whether the governance of the internet in terms of things like domain names ought to be taken out of the current structure where you have a quasi-private entity that just distributes the name in a neutral fashion, and whether the UN ought to take over governance of the internet, which would then allow countries to set, quote, rules for how you operate in the internet, including whether you ought to have national internets, that I think would be fundamentally inconsistent with what is positive about the internet, which is its global nature. So I do think this is an area where, maybe more than any other, popular outcry and popular engagement will be critical in defining the shape of the internet going forward. But I'm going to argue you have to be in the middle. You have to. I'd like to see the people who use the internet push back against censorship. On the other hand, I don't want them to be so wedded to the idea of anarchy on the internet and kind of a freewheeling place where no rules apply, that it becomes a haven for criminals and other kinds of bad actors to steal your money or steal your identity or otherwise harm people, because that can be equally damaging to the internet. To me, you want to have, with the internet, freedom, but freedom requires that there have to be some rules. Just like, you want to have the freedom to drive down the highway, but if you don't have lanes and stoplights, that could quickly become a major car crash. So it is an area where I think people are going to have to take a real interest and hopefully steer a course between the extremes of anarchy and the extremes of repression.
Okay, we're technically out of time, but you've been waiting here in the front, so we'll try to squeeze in one final question and a brief response.
My name is Basma Tribi, and I'm a graduate student in international relations from the American University in Cairo. I'm an Egyptian and an Arab, of course. And the topic is very interesting for me, not only because of my field of study, but because of what's happening in the past week in my country. I have a couple of comments regarding, I couldn't agree more on the exchange programs between students here and back home. As an exchange student myself at an American university here, I benefited a lot, and so as many of my friends and family. But I have to highlight that the U.S. does not fully align its soft power with its hard power. I worked at National Democratic Institute back home before the raids, before it had to get closed, and people on the streets couldn't see why the soft power wasn't aligned with the hard power programs of the U.S. So how come that you're investing in development at the same time? People had to flee. The Americans had to flee the country. So I had to explain this. I had to explain that I'm the one who wrote letters to the SCAF and to people at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs that we are having meetings from our NGO and from the people on the streets. And at the same time, I couldn't explain that much when they had to flee the country. So being caught in between politics and real life, you can't explain that much and saying that the U.S. is for cultural diplomacy or the U.S. is for the interest of the Middle East, so forth or so on. And another point is I believe that the U.S. is not the pioneer in soft power in the Middle East nowadays. I think with Qatar and Al Jazeera, I've done some research on the Arab Spring and how Qatar used Al Jazeera for its foreign policy and propelled its image of a regional leader. In contrast to the U.S., decreasing power in the region, it's very interesting for us as Egyptians to see such a small country of a growing economic power causing that much damage or that much influence in the region. So I think that the geopolitics of the region is shifting, not only because of the Arab Spring, but because the economy and the money is shifting from major countries to small countries with huge economic powers. So
I think that's a great point, actually. And you said something which is really thought-provoking, which is to look at the role of Qatar, which is a wealthy country, but certainly militarily is, not in the same league as the United States, and yet had huge influence throughout the region because they've used their economic power, but also their megaphone through Al Jazeera in a very effective way. And it actually raises a really interesting question, whether in terms of the way, we look at countries of influence around the world, and we spend a lot of time worrying about Russia and China, and for a very good reason. I'm not sure when we think strategically, we look at countries that are very shrewd about how they influence, and to use the expression you hear sometimes, that punch above their weight in terms of global influence, because they're able to strategically harness their money and their megaphone using the media. So to your first point, although I'm not sure exactly how the fact that the National Democratic Institute people had to flee Egypt, how that translates to American hard power. I will agree with your general proposition. I think we have not always been effective in synchronizing and coordinating our hard power and our soft power. It's largely an artifact of the way the U.S. government works, where you have different departments that do different things. And in theory, what's supposed to happen at the White House is they're supposed to kind of look across the entire domain and say, you know what, we got to coordinate the soft power, the hard power, Department of Education. It's all got to have a kind of a single strategy that we work together. We're not always good at doing that. And, I'm not novel in making this criticism, but I would argue that maybe now more than 10 years ago even, or certainly more than 20 years ago, when we think about national security, we have to think in a broader way. And someone has to look at all the elements, including the example of a cutter, and figure out how do you make them work in a way that operates together rather than sometimes at cross purpose. So I think those are both really good observations.
Thank you very much. I'm not surprised that your excellent keynote address has inspired many more questions than we have time for, but unfortunately we do need to come to a close. I'd ask everyone to please join in a second round of applause for Secretary Michael Chertoff. Thank you.